Racist judge finds. Black man then learns. He's a federal prosecutor. He was fined simply for being a few minutes late. But no one in that courtroom knew he was the federal prosecutor who had dismantled an international human trafficking network. And this time, he hadn't come to bow his head. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. 8:42 a.m. The digital clock on the dashboard blinked like it was trying to remind Crispin Robinson that he was late. Under the blazing sunlight of Greenville, South Carolina, Crispin pulled his car into the lot beside the city courthouse. His neatly trimmed hair glistened faintly with sweat, and a sliver of unease crossed his otherwise sharp gaze, rare for a man used to walking into life-and-death trials. Crispin was never late. As a federal prosecutor with nearly 14 years of service at the United States Department of Justice, he had brought dozens of traffickers, money launderers, and corrupt officials to light. He believed in discipline, detail, and punctuality, like they were etched into his professional DNA. But this morning was different. Just hours earlier, a defense attorney in Charlotte had filed an emergency motion to change a key witness in an ongoing federal trafficking case. Crispin had only 45 minutes to respond, or risk the entire case being delayed. That case involved at least 7 underage girls, spanned 3 states, and required over 2 years of coordinated investigation with Interpol. When he finished, he had exactly 22 minutes to get to the city courthouse to deal with a personal matter, a minor property tax dispute, and he had made it on time, by civilian standards. In Crispin's hand was a 38-page file containing property photos, tax receipts, and house appraisals from 2017 to the present. The house, located on Haywood Street, had once belonged to his grandmother, the woman who had raised him through childhood. A modest colonial revival home with darkened shingles, it was the first place Crispin had learned about fairness, dignity, and the reason he chose law in the first place. The home's value had remained stable for 5 years, yet this year, the city sent a tax notice indicating a 30% increase without clear justification. He couldn't let it slide as a mere clerical error. To Crispin, it was a matter of principle. Even if it was an old house, it stood as a testament to hard work and self-respect. Wearing a crisp navy suit and neatly pressed white cuffs, Crispin stepped into the main hallway of the courthouse. The aging interior of the city court was a far cry from the federal buildings, where he usually worked. No bulletproof glass, no legal libraries, no trace of high-tech infrastructure. Everything carried the scent of time, early brewed coffee, old paper, and the tense silence of people here for parking fines, neighborhood spats, or petty lawsuits. His eyes landed on an elderly woman holding a stack of documents, her hands trembling. A man in a denim jacket bowed his head, searching his wallet. Everyone looked fragile, like they could be crushed by a verdict from behind the bench. Crispin's phone buzzed. A message popped up. "Be careful." Judge Dermott is notorious for cracking down on late arrivals. He exhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a beat, letting the pressure settle. He wasn't worried. He had evidence. He had reason. And he'd never lost a court case on personal grounds. What Crispin didn't know was that today he wasn't walking into a tax hearing. He was stepping into the heart of a decades-old machine of injustice. And within the hour, what began as a minor fine would trigger a state-level investigation, unseat a long-standing judge, and shake a city's faith in justice. His battle had only just begun. 8:50 a.m. Crispin Robinson stopped in front of courtroom 204. A tarnished brass plaque hung crookedly, etched with the name Judge Dermott. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open, his eyes scanning the familiar, yet never welcoming space. The room was a long rectangle, its mustard yellow walls blotched, as though time itself had worn them thin. Rows of wooden benches sat in neat lines, but the cracked leather cushions revealed the worn foam beneath. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, pushing out air that felt as damp and heavy as old ink. Every pen tap, every light cough, every button undone, echoed with clarity in the tension-choked silence. Crispin chose a seat in the back row, where he could observe the courtroom like the rear lens of an investigation. He opened his tax file, flipped through the pages, reviewing each line, carefully, methodically, as he always did before any hearing. From the front, the back door of the courtroom swung open. A tall figure entered. It was Dermot. His long black robe brushed lightly across the tiled floor. His skin was pale, nearly bloodless, hair silver and combed neatly back, eyes ice blue like tempered steel. Without a gavel strike, without a word spoken, the room fell silent, like it were holding its breath. "All rise," Dante, the veteran bailiff, called out steadily. Crispin rose with the others. Dermot's gaze swept across the room, stopping at no one in particular, but leaving behind a discomfort, as if each person had just been scanned by an X-ray. And then, less than a minute later, it began. Dermot started calling cases with a rhythm more suited to inventory than justice. One name after another. Someone stepped forward, made a brief statement, and Dermot either nodded or handed down a decision. No one was allowed more than 2 minutes. His most common phrase was, "Next case." A white man, probably in his early 40s, wearing a gray blazer, slipped in late during an ongoing case. He took a seat in the third row. No one, not even Dermot, so much as glanced at him. 10 minutes later, a young woman in ripped jeans and a messy blonde ponytail walked in, holding an iced coffee, then casually took a front row seat. No warnings, no disapproving looks from anyone. Crispin remained silent, but his eyes had sharpened like a scalpel. In the world of justice, small differences often signal larger problems, and with over a decade of experience investigating civil rights violations, he recognized something was wrong with how things operated here. That became even clearer as he noticed Dermot never asked any follow-up questions to the white defendants. Cases were resolved swiftly. Many were dismissed with a verbal warning. No records, no fines. Crispin checked his watch. It was nearly 9:10 a.m. His documents were in perfect order. He had rechecked the tax tables from each year, the adjustment codes from the state of South Carolina, and photographs of the house as visual evidence. Each item bore a notarized stamp and the signature of an independent appraiser. But there was one thing he hadn't prepared for, not legal logic or procedural formality, but personal bias disguised beneath a judge's robe. The courtroom moved forward like an old clock without a minute hand, cold, unfeeling, and unnervingly precise. But Crispin knew that the moment his name was called, everything would shift. And he was ready, not just to present a tax dispute, but to uncover a truth that many in that room had seen for years, yet none had dared to speak aloud. 9:15 a.m. The name Crispin Robinson rang out in the hushed courtroom like the spark that ignites a moment of reckoning. He stood, walking steadily toward the podium with the calm, measured gait of someone who had stood before hundreds of juries and thousands of scrutinizing eyes. But the moment Crispin entered Judge Dermot's line of sight, the room's atmosphere turned cold, as though a dark current had swept in. Dermot's icy eyes narrowed, and his voice cut through the air without the slightest leniency. "You're late." He didn't give Crispin a chance to speak. "Do you think this court's time is a toy? This isn't your office. This is the Greenville court, where the law is the only thing that matters, and you just disrespected it." Crispin raised both hands gently, palms open in a polite gesture, asking to explain. "Your Honor, I'm with the Department of Justice. This morning, I received an urgent petition regarding a human trafficking case involving 3 underage victims." "I don't care about your high-profile cases, Mr. Robinson," Dermot interrupted coldly. "Here, you're nobody. You violated courtroom protocol, and I won't let that slide." He raised the gavel, A sharp, lifeless thud echoed. This court fines Mr. Crispin Robinson $750 for contempt and disruption of proceedings. No one in the room dared to breathe too loudly. Crispin said nothing, but his jaw tightened. His eyes met Dermot's directly, without defiance, without submission, but with full clarity. To his left, the white man in the gray blazer, who had arrived at least 5 minutes later than Crispin, still sat undisturbed, never reprimanded. And earlier, the blonde girl who'd walked in with a Starbucks and casually scrolled through her phone had gone entirely unmentioned. No warning. No disapproving glance. Crispin returned to the back row, his head slightly bowed as if reflecting on the fine. But in reality, he was calculating. Every word Dermot had spoken, every action in that courtroom, was now part of a living case file that Crispin would not let fade into silence. In the corner, the bailiff Dante gave a faint nod, as if to say, "I saw it all." His eyes didn't show surprise, just a familiar weariness, the kind that belongs to someone who's witnessed far too many instances of injustice being quietly ignored. A black woman nearby clicked her tongue softly, while a law student in the front row had stopped writing, now staring at Crispin with an expression of thinly veiled outrage and disbelief. Crispin looked down at his tax file, then back at the bench. The anger inside him didn't erupt. It sat cold, quiet, and deep, just as he operated when investigating civil rights cases. No rash moves, no dramatics. He didn't need to cause a scene. He only needed to prove the truth. And today, that truth had just revealed itself through the seemingly mundane action of a man in a black robe, punishing a black man for arriving late, while turning a blind eye to white individuals who had committed the same violation. Crispin knew well. This wasn't just a routine hearing. This was the gateway to exposing a deeply entrenched system of bias, and Judge Dermot had just left his clearest fingerprint on it. And from that moment forward, Crispin was no longer just a citizen appealing a tax dispute. He had become a witness, a victim, and soon, the one who would expose an entire courtroom. Crispin Robinson returned to the back row with steady steps, his gaze no longer reflecting just pain. It had shifted into the sharp focus of a man who had begun an investigation. He opened a black leather notebook, the kind he always used to record sensitive details during federal cases. The pen moved without pause, documenting every minute, every event, every word spoken by Judge Dermot. The first line he wrote was clear and deliberate. Unjust penalty, blatant racial bias, 9:16 a.m. Unlike the investigations Crispin had led before, this time he was both witness and victim. That dual role sharpened all his senses to an extreme degree. There were no classified files, no recordings, only observation and memory. But those had always been Crispin's most powerful weapons. Something in the atmosphere of the courtroom was shifting. An undercurrent of emotion spread beneath the composed expressions of those present. From the front row, a woman in a wrinkled blouse glanced furtively at Crispin, before bowing her head. In the far left corner, a middle-aged man holding a construction violation notice clenched his fists, as if trying to restrain something boiling within. The bailiff Dante stood by the worn wooden door, his tired eyes tilting slightly when they met Crispin's. It wasn't a look of surprise, it was acknowledgement. A silent nod, wordless but unmistakable, as if to say, "You're not imagining it. I see this every week." At the back row along the wall, a law student, likely a second year, with her hair in a tidy bun and a red pen in hand, was taking notes at a furious pace. She wasn't just writing down case content, she was sketching the layout of the courtroom, who sat where, who spoke, how people reacted. Her cheeks were flushed, not from heat, but from a mixture of outrage and stunned disbelief that she couldn't hide. Crispin looked up and began cross-referencing. He logged the previous defendants in order. 857. Gregory T., white male, speeding violation, no fine. 9:04, Amy C., white female, parking dispute, verbal warning. 9:11, Taylor R., white male, arrived 8 minutes late, no remark. He, black, a federal public servant, late by 5 minutes, was fined an amount equivalent to 1/3 of a low-income family's utility bill for 2 months. As Dermott continued calling the next cases, Crispin noticed something else. The judge's tone shifted based on the defendant's race. For white defendants, a soft voice, sometimes even joking. For defendants of color, sharp, curt, and cut off their sentences before they could finish. A black woman named Marlene was called next. She trembled as she carried a folder of parking citations. When she began to explain, "I'm sorry, I have a young child," and couldn't leave the car right away, Dermott cut her off. "No sorries. This isn't the place for sob stories." Crispin leaned forward and added a bold line to his notebook. Black defendant not allowed to explain circumstances. Clear differential treatment. He was beginning to see it plainly. This wasn't merely a mishandled individual case. This was a systemic operation of bias, persistent, cold, and dangerous. Dermott wasn't just strict, as rumored. He selectively chose who to be strict with. Crispin quietly flipped to a new page. Beneath the heading Observation Log, Greenville Court, he wrote a single sentence. This isn't justice. This is a pattern. And deep inside, he already knew. If he stayed silent, he would become part of that silence. But if he spoke out, it would no longer be just about a baseless tax hearing. It would be about a system that needed exposure. And Crispin had never feared the truth. The courtroom had begun to thin out after more than an hour of tense proceedings. Attendees left quietly, one by one, a few glancing back at Crispin with curious expressions, part admiration, part anticipation. No one knew exactly who he was, but everyone sensed that this man was unlike the usual crowd contesting parking tickets. Crispin remained seated, his head slightly bowed, his hand gently gripping the leather-bound notebook, now nearly full. But in his mind, every detail he had just witnessed was assembling itself into a complete structure. He was no longer angry. He was preparing. 9:47 a.m. While Dermott reviewed case files before him, his voice flat and mechanical like a text reader, Crispin suddenly rose. There was no announcement, no name called. He walked to the center of the courtroom, each step measured and firm, slowing down the room's every sound. Dante, the bailiff, shifted slightly. Judge Dermott looked up, his brow furrowing. "Your case is concluded, Mr. Robinson. If you wish to file an appeal or submit supplemental documents, do so through the clerk." Crispin raised his hand, but this time not to present a document. Instead, he reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a gold-edged identification badge from the U.S. Department of Justice. The double-headed eagle emblem shimmered faintly under the flickering fluorescent light. He spoke slowly, clearly, with no need to raise his voice. "My name is Crispin Robinson. I am a federal prosecutor under the Department of Justice for the North Carolina-South Carolina District. For the past 12 years, I've handled cases involving human trafficking, government corruption, and civil rights violations. And this morning, I responded to an emergency petition in a federal trafficking case involving 3 states and 2 underage victims." The air in the room froze. From the back row, the female law student stopped taking notes, her lips parting slightly. An older man in a checkered shirt leaned forward, his eyes suddenly lit. Dermott remained still, his hand resting on the stack of files, unmoving. Crispin continued. "I was fined $750 this morning for being just under 6 minutes late, but I'm not here to argue that. I'm here to make something clear. I cannot turn a blind eye to what I've witnessed over the past 45 minutes. In the same hearing, I saw at least 3 people arrive late, 2 scroll through their phones during court, and one interrupt the judge mid-sentence, yet not one of them was fined, warned, or even looked at sternly. He turned slightly, eyes directed toward the benches where others had recently sat. All of them were white defendants. Dermot opened his mouth as if to interject, but Crispin cut him off, not with words, but with a piercing, unyielding look. As a public servant within the U.S. justice system, I am obligated to report any signs of bias, injustice, or racial discrimination within legal proceedings. What I witnessed today was not consistent with strictness. It was selective enforcement, and that selectivity followed skin color. The silence in the courtroom was no longer the silence of surprise. It was the silence of confrontation. Every person in that room had seen it. Perhaps they'd stayed quiet out of fear, habit, or the belief that they were too small to matter. But today, someone had spoken. Dermot said awkwardly, "If you feel you've been treated unfairly, you may file a formal complaint with the Oversight Board." Crispin stepped toward the bench, his gaze unwavering. "I've documented everything. Every reaction, every word, every ruling. And I will be submitting a detailed report to the State Judicial Oversight Committee, not as revenge, but to ensure that if this has been an ongoing pattern, it won't continue in silence." The courtroom was so quiet that one could hear the rustle of papers as an elderly woman stuffed her documents into her bag. Crispin waited for no response. He bowed his head slightly, then turned and walked toward the exit. That afternoon, Crispin Robinson sat in his office on the 7th floor of the Federal Justice Building in Columbia. Through the window, the late sunlight swept across the administrative district's buildings. But in his mind, everything still revolved around courtroom 204 in Greenville. He opened his laptop, adjusted his notes, and began drafting a 12-page report, complete with appendices citing civil law statutes and judicial conduct guidelines. On the title line, he typed decisively, "Preliminary Report on Judicial Bias, Judge Dermot." The document was sent directly to his immediate supervisor, Rulia Harper, a seasoned federal attorney who had served at the Department of Justice for nearly 3 decades. Less than 2 hours later, Julia called back. Her voice, usually curt and composed, carried unexpected concern and gravity this time. "Crispin, I've read it. If everything is as you described, this is no longer a matter of ethics. This is a systemic violation, and possibly a civil rights violation," Crispin replied. "I don't think this is the first time." Without waiting for instructions, he moved into action the same way he always did when handling major cases, identifying patterns, collecting evidence, and reconstructing systems. He began by requesting copies of all administrative rulings issued in courtroom 204 over the past 5 years. As a federal prosecutor, he had access to public judicial databases, and within 48 hours, he had gathered 1,284 municipal violation case files processed under Judge Dermot's authority. Crispin used data analysis software to compare penalty levels by race. The initial results stunned even him. 73% of black defendants had received the maximum statutory penalties. In contrast, only 18% of white defendants received equivalent fines. Requests from white defendants for deferred payments, installment plans, or personal explanations were granted at a rate 4.5 times higher than those from black defendants. 1 week later, the State Judicial Oversight Committee received a formal report from the Department of Justice. An independent team of investigators was dispatched to Greenville. There, a surprising revelation opened a second front in the investigation. Eleanor Thompson, a court clerk who had served in courtroom 204 for 19 years, was initially cautious when approached by the investigators. But when one of them mentioned Crispin Robinson's name, she paused, then pulled from her desk drawer an old leather-bound notebook, its corners frayed and bound with a rubber band. "I'm not sure if this helps," she said, voice trembling. But I've been keeping track of everything that didn't feel right for the past 6 years. The notebook contained more than 150 entries: dates, defendant names, race, violation type, Dermot's reactions, and specific penalties. There were lines like August 29th, 2021, JL, white, 2 repeat violations, verbal warning, and February 3rd, 2023, KT, black, same offense, maximum fine plus refusal to hear explanation. Combined with Crispin's data, the picture that emerged was chillingly clear. Dante, the aging bailiff from the courtroom, was also brought in. He stood upright, hands clasped behind his back, eyes steady and unflinching. I've manned the door of that courtroom for 15 years. I know what bias looks like. I saw it every day. But I wasn't a prosecutor, not someone who could speak up, until the day Crispin walked in. He paused for a moment, then said slowly, "I can't go back and fix the past, but I can stand with the truth right now." The investigation had now moved beyond the case of a wrongly fined citizen. It had become a statewide inquiry into racial discrimination by a municipal judge, and the one who sparked it all was the very man once dismissed and humiliated for arriving just a few minutes late. The next morning, just as Crispin stepped into his office, his phone began to ring non-stop. Not from fellow prosecutors or federal coordination units, but from the press. CNN, the Washington Post, NPR, even local TV stations. They all wanted to interview the man who had stood in the middle of a courtroom and spoken out about the injustice everyone had seen, but no one had dared to name. The spark hadn't come from the Department of Justice. It started with a small post. A second-year law student who had attended the hearing, named Jamie Nguyen, had written a 1,500-word piece on Medium recounting the entire incident. She recorded Judge Dermot's words, Crispin's response, and especially the moment when the prosecutor's badge was revealed in a room taut with tension. Within 24 hours, the article had surpassed 280,000 views. On Twitter, the hashtag #EqualJusticeNow climbed into the national top 3 trends. Thousands of people shared their experiences of discrimination in the court system. Some had been unfairly fined for minor administrative errors, others denied payment extensions, and some publicly scolded by judges simply for how they dressed. A headline in the Greenville Sentinel, the local daily, blared in bold red. Federal Prosecutor alleges racial bias in Greenville City Court. Immediately, TV crews swarmed outside City Hall, interviewing residents. A 38-year-old black woman named Lorna Willis stood before the camera, eyes blazing with long-held anger. "Judge Dermot fined me $500 for placing my trash sign in the wrong spot, even though I had city approval. I knew I was treated unfairly, but I never thought I'd live to see someone brave enough to publicly call him out." A young man, Marcus Kelly, 22 years old, sent a letter to MSNBC recounting the time Dermot publicly questioned him about whether he was actually employed or just living off welfare. Meanwhile, a white defendant with 3 consecutive parking violations had been allowed by Dermot to pay in installments over 6 months, something that, according to Crispin's data, had never once been granted to a black defendant. The ripple effect didn't stop at social media. Civil rights groups across the state, such as South Carolina Justice Watch and Voices for Equity, quickly held press conferences, demanding a broader investigation, not just into Dermot, but into all local-level judges across the system. Under public pressure, the South Carolina State Judicial Oversight Commission was forced to release an official statement confirming, "We have initiated a special investigation into alleged biased judicial practices at the Greenville City Court." Not only was Dermot under scrutiny, a list of 9 other judges across the state, those with opaque judicial records, or unresolved civil complaints, were now subject to review. Amid the storm, Crispin remained silent. He declined interviews, refused to comment, and focused solely on working with federal investigators and a team of data analysts. He understood that while the media stirred emotions, real change came from evidence, from law, and from resolve. That evening, he returned home, opened his laptop, and began reading hundreds of support emails sent from across the country. From young lawyers in the Bronx to high school teachers in Mississippi. One message from a 73-year-old man in Georgia made him pause for a long time. "I thought justice had forgotten us a long time ago. But today, because of you, it feels like it's coming back." And that was when Crispin knew. What he had done wasn't just reporting misconduct. It was igniting an awakening. A movement where, for the first time, the truth could not be buried beneath a judge's robe or silenced by the cold strike of a gavel. 4 weeks after Crispin Robinson stood up in that morning's hearing, the comprehensive report from the South Carolina State Judicial Oversight Commission was released. At 172 pages long, with over 600 pages of data appendices, the report served as a silent indictment of the seemingly untouchable justice system in Greenville. One number sent shockwaves across the state. Black individuals were fined on average 3 times more than white individuals for the same administrative violations under Judge Dermott's jurisdiction. Moreover, when reviewing requests for payment deferrals or installment plans, 84% of white defendants' requests were approved, while only 11% of black defendants received the same consideration. Independent data analysts further revealed that during Dermott's 5-year tenure at Courtroom 204, at least 237 cases showed signs of racial bias, with 71 instances where penalties exceeded the recommended limits in the state's administrative guidelines. The report wasn't based on statistics alone. Testimony from Eleanor Thompson, the courtroom clerk, and her handwritten notebook were cited 32 times throughout the document. That notebook, detailing each incident she deemed irregular, became a vivid record of deliberate, prolonged discriminatory behavior. Also included was the verbatim testimony of Dante, the veteran courtroom security officer, printed on page 39. "I've seen black folks scolded for being 3 minutes late, while white folks showing up 15 minutes late just got a nod. At first, I thought it was just a feeling, but the more I saw, the more I knew. It was real." Under mounting pressure from the system, the press, and the public, by the end of that month, Judge Dermott was forced to appear at a brief press conference in front of the Greenville courthouse. He wore no robe, held no gavel, only a trembling piece of paper in his hands. "For the good of the community, I am stepping down from my position as judge. I never intended to discriminate, but if my actions have caused the public to lose faith in justice, then I believe my resignation is necessary. No applause, no words of regret." Those present, former colleagues, past defendants, and journalists, stood in silence. Dermott's departure wasn't an end. It was a beginning. Immediately following his resignation, the South Carolina State Judicial Commission announced an emergency reform package, including mandatory unconscious bias training for all local judges, quarterly audits of rulings that display signs of disproportionate penalties, the creation of a civilian oversight council composed of community representatives, attorneys, and former defendants, with the authority to recommend case reviews, implementation of a public penalty data analytics system, allowing citizens to search fines by race, gender, and geographic area. The city of Greenville also announced the launch of a reform court, the first pilot model in the state, where judges would rotate quarterly to prevent entrenched abuse of power. At a city council meeting, a black female councilwoman spoke with emotion choking her voice. "None of us wanted this system to collapse, but if it's rotted through, then we must rebuild it from the ground up. At the Department of Justice office, Crispin received an email from a former colleague. You didn't just change one courtroom, you made an entire state take a hard look at itself. 3 months after Crispin Robinson walked out of courtroom 204 with the gleaming prosecutor badge in his hand, and Judge Dermott's cold stare on his back, he was no longer just a whistleblower. He had become a symbol of renewed faith in a justice system capable of change. The first invitation came from the University of South Carolina School of Law, where Crispin had once declined to teach due to a packed trial schedule. This time, he accepted. His first lecture, titled Bias in Justice and the Role of the Brave, was fully booked a week in advance. Over 300 students and faculty packed the lecture hall. No one talked. No one looked at their phones. They simply listened as he spoke, not about statutes, but about systemic silence and how it had been shattered by a single timely statement. Then came a seminar at Yale University. After the talk, a black student approached, eyes shining. I used to think justice was just a concept on paper. But thanks to your story, I know it begins with real actions. Crispin didn't stop at speeches. He and a group of young attorneys founded the Independent Judicial Oversight Center, IJOC, an organization dedicated to collecting, analyzing, and publicly publishing trial data across all 15 counties in South Carolina. Under his guidance, IJOC also partnered with local civil organizations to train citizens on how to appeal decisions, file complaints, and respond when treated unfairly in court. Right in Greenville, courtroom 204, the place where it all began, had been transformed. The walls were repainted a soft ivory gray. The rotting wooden benches were replaced with sleek synthetic leather seating, with designated spaces for the disabled. At the courtroom entrance, a new bronze plaque had been mounted. Justice is a right for all, not a privilege for some. But what moved people most was a quiet display inside Crispin's office, a simple wooden frame containing the printed citation for the $750 fine he received that day. Beneath the citation was a color photograph of 7 students standing in front of the law school gates, holding a sign that read, Robinson Civil Rights Clinic. It was the legacy of a new generation, young people who chose to study law because they believed the law should serve justice, not hide it. Crispin declined all invitations to run for office. He had no desire to enter politics. He believed in the power of action, not in titles. But he accepted a seat on the U.S. Department of Justice's Special Advisory Board, overseeing reform programs in local courts nationwide. Under his name, numerous proposals were implemented, from open courtroom models with public surveillance cameras to a pilot initiative requiring 1 civilian observer per trial. One Friday evening, as Crispin was tidying up his office, Mr. Dante, the former security guard from courtroom 204, walked in carrying a small wooden box. Inside was an old pair of handcuffs, once used to restrain, now offered to Crispin as a symbol of passage. "Keep this," he said, "to remember that justice doesn't come from steel cuffs. It comes from the courage to speak what's right." Crispin smiled gently. In his eyes, there was no more anger or fatigue, only the calm of someone who had weathered the storm and was now ready to lead others through it. Because he knew, change never begins with a crowd. It begins with one person brave enough to say, enough. Nearly a year had passed since Crispin Robinson stepped into courtroom 204, initially just to respond to a minor tax adjustment issue. But the change sparked that day no longer remained confined within the 4 walls of the Greenville courthouse. It had spread beyond state lines, reaching places where justice was once thought never to tread. James Dante, the quiet, aging security guard from that day, had since left his post at the courtroom door to become a lecturer. He was now the lead instructor for the training course, Identifying and Addressing Unconscious Bias in Public Service, a mandatory program for all court personnel in the state of South Carolina. In his first class, he always recounted the moment Crispin stood before the bench, not with bluster, but with the posture of a calm, resolute, unshakable man. I used to think I was just a guard, but that day, I learned that guarding justice doesn't mean staying silent. It means knowing when to speak up when it goes off track. Eleanor Thompson, the court clerk who had quietly recorded injustices for years, had been appointed as the state judicial ethics coordinator. She led an entirely new initiative, the Mentor Clerk Initiative, where young clerks were trained not just in procedure, but also in integrity and civic duty within the legal system. From Chicago, a public defender named Mireya Flores sent a handwritten letter to Crispin's office. In it, she wrote, "I read your story in The Atlantic. I used to feel tired, like the law was a hollow building. But you reminded me why I chose to become a lawyer. Not to defend the law, but to defend people." 3 months later, Mireya launched her first internal investigation in her district, reopening hundreds of administrative cases that showed signs of unfair sentencing in Southside, a predominantly minority neighborhood. The impact spread even further. In Texas, Georgia, and even New Jersey, independent organizations began modeling judicial watchdog centers after IJOC, the institute Crispin co-founded. A survey in Greenville showed public trust in the local court system had risen by 31% in just 10 months, an unprecedented figure in the past 15 years. Then, on an early spring day, the Greenville Center for Judicial Ethics was inaugurated, a complex that included training rooms, a justice library, and a public space where residents could file complaints or seek free legal aid. The building bore the name, the Crispin Robinson Center for Judicial Integrity. At the opening ceremony, Crispin stepped up to the podium under soft golden lighting, with hundreds packed tightly in the hall. He held no script. No paper was needed, for what he was about to say had long lived in his heart. Justice is not just the law. It's how we treat people. It's whether we dare to look injustice in the eye, even when it's cloaked in black robes or done in the name of order. The applause erupted and didn't stop. In the crowd were students he had once taught, former victims of the system, and even court staff who had once stayed silent, now here to begin again. Crispin stood quietly, not with a wide smile, but with a thoughtful gaze. He didn't see himself as a hero, nor did he view this as a victory. He understood something deeper. The fight for justice never ends with a report or a grand ceremony. It continues in every courtroom, every hallway, and every question a citizen dares to ask. Then, as he stepped down from the podium, a black boy about 12 years old ran up to him, eyes glowing. "Are you real? My mom said you changed the whole courthouse. I want to be a lawyer like you someday." Crispin knelt, gently placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You will, kid. And you'll do it even better than I ever did. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to see more. Watch the next video to see how the fight continues.